Welcome to Class 9 of Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we're going to be talking about diagrammatical analysis as we continue our understanding of exegesis in the Old Testament, talking specifically about how we diagram verses and chapters of the Old Testament in order to analyze them in their constituent parts. So let's dive in. What exactly is a diagram? Well, in the one sense, a diagram is a structural outline. However, on the other hand, a diagram is not an outline, since an outline usually has to do with thoughts and ideas. A diagram, on the other hand, is a depiction or a demonstration and picture of the structure of a verse, a structure of a sentence, the way that verses connect to one another, or that various parts of the verse connect to one another. In that way, a diagram is exhaustive. It is not a summary of the structure of a verse, the way that an outline is a summary of the thought or thought flow of a verse. Instead, a diagram will have every part of a verse or verses within the diagram showing how they connect to the other parts within the verse. However, there are no rules for a diagram. Instead, a diagram is a very important tool in your arsenal, an aid, as it were, to help you in analyzing the structure and the syntax of a verse. There are no rules other than that it must be clear to you, the exegete, how the parts of the verse hold together, and it must be clear to your readers, or to those that you are teaching, how the verse holds together. So in that sense, the only rule, per se, is clarity. Other than that, the emphasis is upon it being an aid, it being a tool to help you in your analysis of the verse. So let's jump into an example from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, to show how we actually diagram a verse. We're going to do something a little different in this particular lecture, and that is that we are going to look at everything in English rather than in Hebrew. That way you're able to grasp the material as I'm presenting it, rather than trying to translate the Hebrew that's on the screen. We're going to be diagramming Genesis 1 through 3 in this particular lecture. We would begin with the main verbs, noting where those main verbs are, and putting those main verbs, at least in the way that I do my outlines, all the way to the left. Now, if you're using Hebrew text and you wish to go from right to left, you can, but my mind still works left to right, as often as it works right to left with Hebrew. And so, with the main verbs, I will start on the left-hand side, potentially putting the words in Hebrew, but here in this case putting the verbs in English, as you'll see on the next slide. We then note all the major divisions in the verse, which are usually denoted by a change of audience, or a change of speaker, a change in the subject or the topic, or a change in verse tense. It's also possible that we see divisions based on clauses, as various clauses are used adjectively or adverbally within the sentence. So we can examine the verse for these occurrences, even if they're parataxic or essendetic, and there is no word or simply a vav that creates the clause, we still note that because that clause will be a chunk in our particular diagram here. So in Genesis chapter 1 through 3, we would read, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," and we would structure that, as I have on the next slide. So what do we do with verse 1? God created. Well, we're told when God created, in the beginning, and we're told what God created, the heavens and the earth. Now, occasionally, because in the beginning comes before the main clause, God created, I will sometimes put it on top of the main clause, but still indented. The most important question, though, is how does verse 1 relate to verse 2 and 3? This is reflected in part on the next slide, as I relate verse 1 to verse 2, but really we will not get to the question of verse 3 until 2 slides from now. Verse 2 appears to have 3 main clauses, all starting with a vav, and the earth was, and darkness was, and the Spirit was hovering, although hovering is not really a verb, it is a participle. Darkness and earth, though, are both followed by a form of haya, meaning to be. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit was hovering upon the waters. All 3 clauses, though, starting with vav, means that they all line up together, and in some degree are a package deal. This is not consecutive, this is all happening simultaneously, and yet time is not really the reference. The issue is really setting the stage for what is coming. How, though, does this verse relate to verse 1, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? Well, on the one hand, we start verse 2 with a vav. However, it is not a vukatal or a vayaktol. It is actually vav on eretz, vaeretz, indicating that the earth was formless and void. At first glance, it almost appears as though this is a continuation of verse 1. Verse 1 had a perfect verb, God created, not a vukatal, because the verse begins with Bereshit, but we have a perfect verb, and then here in verse 2 we have two more perfect verbs, and then a participle. So it almost seems as though the earth was is a added thought to verse 1. God created the earth, and the earth was. And it can be taken this way, in which case we would translate the beginning of the verse as and we would have it connected to the main clause of verse 1. How, though, does this verse relate to verse 1, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? Well, on the one hand, we start verse 2 with a vav. However, it is not a vukatal or a vayaktol. It is actually vav on eretz, vaeretz, indicating that the earth was formless and void. At first glance, it almost appears as though this is a continuation of verse 1. Verse 1 had a perfect verb, God created, not a vukatal, because the verse begins with Bereshit, but we have a perfect verb, and then here in verse 2 we have two more perfect verbs, and then a participle. So it almost seems as though the earth was is a added thought to verse 1. God created the earth, and the earth was. And it can be taken this way, in which case we would translate the beginning of the verse as and we would have it connected to the main clause of verse 1. However, there is a second way to read verse 2. Actually, there are four ways to read the relationship between verse 2 and verses 1 and 3, although I'm only addressing two in this lecture because only two of them seem to have substantial merit, even though all four have been argued throughout history. The first was that verse 1 goes with verse 2 and are connected the way that we've described them, but it's also possible that verse 1 is simply a summary, and that the perfect is being used, not in terms of past tense, as though God in the past created heavens and earth, and now the earth was formless and void, but that, verse 1, God created the heavens and the earth. It's perfect, it's done, it's completed. And then verse 2 actually begins explaining some information that we need to know prior to verse 3. In this case, verse 2 would be translated as, now the earth was formless and void, not and the earth was formless and void, connecting it back to verse 1, the earth was created and it was formless and void, but instead giving the circumstantial evidence or the circumstances prior to creation in verse 3, the background information to the story. The earth was formless and void, and then, verse 3, the two Vayaktols, God said, and there was light. This is the advantage of diagramming and diagrammatical analysis, not that it answers all of our questions, but that it points out where the questions need to be asked. Where does verse 2 connect to verse 3? It helps us understand the importance of determining the structure of the verse in terms of translation, but also in terms of understanding. Is verse 2 connected to verse 1, or is verse 2 connected to verse 3? If we simply translated it, or even if we simply did syntactical analysis, we might actually miss this point. But by diagramming the sentence and the verses, we have been forced to deal with where we put verse 2. Depending on how one decides to relate verse 2 to the rest of the passage, you might have two different looking diagrams. It's possible to have a diagram that relates verse 2 to verse 1, so that verse 1 and verse 2 line up with one another all the way to the left, God created being in line with the other verbs of verse 2. It's also possible, though, that verse 2 is indented as background information to verse 3. In fact, to that matter, it's actually possible to have verse 1 and verse 2 indented as background to verse 3, indicating that God created the heavens and the earth in the past, that God created the heavens and the earth formless and void in the past, and that now, in verses 3 and following, he is adding form to what is formless. There are different theological aspects to each of these potential theories, but we need to understand at least here what the grammar allows before we move on to our theological interpretation. Just a quick refresher on the importance of accent marks within the Hebrew text. Remember, of course, that the accent marks have been added in by the Masoretes about 1,000 years after the time of Christ, although based on a tradition that apparently precedes the time of Christ. So there has great history and tradition behind it. However, as we consider these, we need to remember that it's possible that the Masoretes had something wrong, or that we should not diagram it the way that they have the verse divided up. However, the accents can be very helpful in indicating how the Masoretes understood the verse should be broken up and diagrammed, and that is why we're mentioning it here. Unfortunately, it doesn't help us answer the question of whether verse 2 goes with verse 1 or verse 3, but it does help us with the actual breakdown of these verses. Obviously, the most powerful disjunctive accent is the sof pasuk and the saluk, which comes in the last word at the end of the verse. In many cases, this is the end of the thought. However, in some cases, it is the end of the verse, but it is not the end of the thought, so that you actually have a sof pasuk and a saluk in a word that is not the actual end of the sentence. Instead, it might be in the middle of the sentence, but it's at least in a part of the sentence where the Masoretes felt it could be broken, where it could be divided up into verses. Thus, the verse divisions are very important, but they are not necessarily absolutely correct. So we need to examine the sof pasuk and make sure that it is the end of a thought and not simply an opportunity to catch your breath before you continue the thought. The same with atnak, which occurs in the middle of the sentence and divides the verse up into two sections. Again, within the major books of the Old Testament, this is the center of the thought of that particular verse, but it may not necessarily be the middle grammatically or the middle in terms of word count. It may also be the middle of a thought, but not the middle of the thought, so that the placement of atnak is important, but it may not be a place where we actually divide our diagram. We also have ol voriorid, which again serves as a major accent and disjunctive. This is a disjunctive that takes place in the three, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, and takes the place of atnak, although in shorter verses atnak will still be used, but it functions the same. At least in Hebrew, we divide our verses up into two sections for parallelism, but occasionally there are tricolons or three parallel sections to a verse. Ol Vayorid, though, will only divide the verse into two sections, and so we'll have to use context to determine where the break in our diagram should actually take place. But again, these accents are very helpful in helping us see the flow of thought in the verse, even though they may occasionally be placed in an incorrect place or are placed because they're needed in terms of rhythm or in terms of taking a break as you're reading the verse, but not in terms of a break in the thought. So while we may start there, we need to examine them to see if we need to follow them in our diagram. The next level of disjunctive accents are the kings. The kings are in service to the emperors. The emperors either ended a verse or divided a verse in half. The kings divide those halves into halves, thereby dividing the verse into quarters. These three accents, or families of accents listed here, are found only in the 21. They do not occur in the three books of Psalms, Jobs, or Proverbs. There are two accents in some places listed here because the second is a rare form of the first, replacing it from time to time, but it is not necessary to know the name of the second because of how rare it occurs. You should be familiar with the name of the first in each list, although the level of kings is pretty much the last level of disjunctive accents where you need to be familiar with the name. A zakaf, which is either a zakaf katon or a zakaf gadol, divides atnak sections, dividing a sentence into quarters, either dividing the first half of the verse into quarters or the second half into quarters. A segolta, which is replaced very rarely by a shalshelet, divides only the first atnak section. If segolta occurs, it will never be found in the second half of the verse. Occasionally, segolta will mark the end of the first third of the verse, but again, that is not as common as it dividing the first atnak section into a quarter. Tifka is located here in our list under kings because from time to time Tifka may divide a verse. However, most often Tifka divides zakaf sections in longer verses, thereby actually making Tifka more of a prince because it's in service to zakaf, which is a king. But you need to be familiar with Tifka because of the fact that it may divide short verses in half. These particular accents function exactly the same as the ones on the previous slide. They divide the verse up into smaller sections, but again, we need to be careful to make sure that the sections that are divided up are actual thoughts within the verse, since that's what we're going to be diagramming in our diagrams. So we have Zakaph, which looks like the two dots, looks like a vocal or silent schwa floating over the letters, a Segolta, which looks like an upside-down segol, hence the name Segolta, or a Shawshellet, which looks like a squiggly line that functions very similar to a Segolta, although it will be followed by that straight line after the word, and a Tifka, which may be one of the most common. It divides the verse or the Zakaph sections up into smaller sections. Again, as we get ready to diagram, we consider the accents, consider the breaks, and see if it's necessary for us to follow this in our understanding and diagramming of the verse. Just a reminder of the major disjunctives within the three: Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. Again, we have Segolta, which looks like an upside-down segol. We have Tsinor, which sounds Spanish and actually looks like the little squiggly line over an N in Spanish that divides up those Segolta sections. Ravias that function like Tifka, and Dechi, which looks exactly like Tifka, but is actually called Dechi in the three. Again, these particular accents will divide up poetic language into smaller sections. And again, we review them the same way we do in prose. Do we agree with the placement? Do we agree with the break in thought? Here is the breakdown of accents from verse 1, in the beginning, which is how we have it diagrammed as well, followed by Tifka, dividing this off from God created, which is then followed by the Atnak, dividing that half of the verse from the heavens and the earth. So we agree with the markings of the Masoretes here in their diagramming. The same is true in verse 3. And God said, Tifka, let there be light. Atnak, and there was light. Again, dividing the verse up into the same sections that we have in our diagram. In some cases, the Masoretes actually divide up the verse into more sections than we would. So in this case here in verse 2, they actually divide the last clause, the Spirit of God was hovering on the face of the waters, into 3 sections instead of 2, which may be different than our particular diagram. This has to do with some of the rules of accents in conjunctive accents and disjunctive accents, and the requirement that you add in a disjunctive after a certain number of conjunctives. So this is the case here, where after the Spirit of God, a Zakaph has been placed, dividing this from the hovering, which comes after the Tifka, and then on the face of the waters, which is followed by the Sof Pasuk. Again, we may not actually follow this division of 3 sections in the last clause instead of 2, but this is how the Masoretes have noted it. So in this particular instance, the accent markings have confirmed that our division of the various parts of each verse are correct. However, it has not answered the question for us as to whether verse 2 goes with verse 1 or with verse 3. I've translated it here as though it goes with verse 3, again, just simply based on theology and tradition, and we can discuss this further in class if you so desire. However, I recommend that you read the commentaries, both by Kidner and by Waltke on this particular subject, as well as the New American Commentary, as there is good information on the debate, keeping in mind that this is a debate that has been going on for thousands of years as to whether these 2 verses go together, 1 with 2, or 2 with 3, or 1 and 2, as setting the background for 3. 1 here is labeled as a summary statement. Verse 2 is indicated as coming prior and setting the circumstances of verse 3. Again, if you chose to see 1 and 2 as connected with each other, you would indent verse 1 further. The value of the diagram, again, has been to raise these questions in our minds as to how exactly we handle the particular parts of this verse in terms of structure. What part goes with what part, and how is that reflected in our translation? This is the value of diagramming. It forces you to ask questions that you may otherwise have skipped. Well, that brings us to the end of this lesson. Hopefully this has been helpful and you understand the value of diagramming a verse and the impact that accents can make on the verse in terms of showing us where the division should be, keeping in mind that the Masoretes are not always correct and that we're not required to follow the Masoretic notation. However, as we consider our diagrams, we are forced to ask questions that we might otherwise not have asked, and to consider issues within the text that may not be overly obvious as we consider the syntax of the verse. This diagramming allows us to move just a little bit beyond the syntactical level to the structure of the paragraph, or the structure of the chapter, as we consider the way the argument itself holds together, not just in terms of thought, but structurally. How does each clause fit in with each other clause? Well, hopefully you have learned from this and are ready to use this in your upcoming exercise of diagramming structurally the passage that you'll be using for your final paper. I look forward to seeing you in class.